Hello, my name is Teresa Skelton and I'm a candidate for the Justice and Anti-Corruption Party. I'm also the secretary to the Hampshire Police Monitoring Group. Now I'm making a small documentary and it will be divided up into 3 parts. Part A is my response to Eastleigh News regarding Simon Hayes, the ex-Police and Crime Commissioner for Hampshire. The item was placed on the internet on the 8th of Feb 2020 of this year. Part B is about Olivia Pinkney, the current Chief Constable of Hampshire. And Part C will be describing the Hampshire Police and Crime Panel and all its associates. This is Simon Hayes. He was Police and Crime Commissioner for Hampshire from 2012 to 2016. His job was to regulate the Chief Constable. I've only met him in person on 3 occasions. The most dramatic of these was in January 2016. This was at a public meeting from which I was violently ejected. Now, I've only ever attended one other police meeting before the 22nd of January 2016, and that was the Compass meeting held in June 2014, and that was in the Guildhall in Winchester. Now, at the top table were 2 gentlemen. Here they are. On the left, Mr. Hayes. On the right, the then Chief Constable, Andy Marsh. My issue involved the police using falsified documentation against me in a minor prosecution dated 2004. To both gentlemen, I had written several letters, especially to Simon Hayes, which I can say was nearly a dozen. Both gentlemen' letters were marked private and confidential. They claimed, after I explained what had happened to me, that they didn't know anything about my case. They hadn't received one letter and they didn't know who I was. Absolutely outrageous. Now, after the meeting, Andy Marsh sent a police officer round the house. He took my details, went off, and I never saw anything about him again or heard nothing. Simon Hayes shook my hand. We had a gentleman's agreement that he was going to look into it, and he never did. I never saw him again. He never replied to any future letters that I sent him, and that was the end of that. I never saw him again until the meeting on the 22nd of January 2016. Nadine O'Connor was the next person to speak, and she first asked the audience how many were members of the public, because there was a lot of officialdom there. Anyway, I won't talk about all what she said, but why she walked out of that meeting was this. Andy Marsh, the ex-Chief Constable, said he had been exonerated over his lack of investigation regarding the abuse at the Stanbridge Earls School. And she was surprised at that. And she said, well, who exonerated you? And he looked at the person next to him at the top table, which was Simon Hayes, the PCC, and he said he did. She then said to Simon Hayes, but you're under investigation for expenses fraud. And he looked at Andy Marsh and said, I've been exonerated. And she said, who exonerated you? And he said, the Chief Constable has. They both investigate each other and find each other not guilty. There was no transparency. It was a complete shock at that meeting to a lot of people that they'd both been exonerated. They exonerated themselves. And she put a tape over her mouth, just like this, and said the meeting was a farce and walked out. I think she had every right to do that. She never swore. She never became abusive. But I think the shock of both of them exonerating themselves and finding each other not guilty, I think that was her conclusion. This meeting is a farce. There was something very sinister about the June 2014 meeting. Simon Hayes, the PCC, had allowed the BBC to record the meeting and to stand at the front and record the public's faces. However, as a member of the public, we were told we couldn't record. After the meeting, I found out that Nadine O'Connor had made a complaint regarding Simon Hayes inviting the BBC without telling the public, and her complaint was upheld. To complain about Hampshire PCC, we're told to go to the Hampshire Police and Crime Panel, the HP and CP. After 7 more months of silence from Simon Hayes, that's what I did. It's a criminal offence for police to falsify documents, yet Mr. Hayes was doing nothing to get the Chief Constable to act. Even so, the panel threw out my complaint and then described me as an unreasonable complainant. When I applied for the minutes of the complaint subcommittee, these weren't forthcoming. Now, the panel makes a big show of inviting us to their meetings. They claim that they are responsive to our views. This page speaks for itself, especially it says, members of the public are encouraged to attend meetings of the panel. It adds that members of the public can put questions to the panel in line with its rules. This is what I did. The HPCP meeting of 22nd of January 2016 was even advertised in the Hampshire Chronicle on the 18th. The news item stated, anyone is welcome to attend the meeting, except, as it turned out, me. No sooner had I emailed my question about the lack of transparency of the HP and CP's proceedings over my complaint against Mr. Hayes than I received an official letter banning me from attending. This suggested that I would be likely to disrupt the meeting. I wrote several times asking why the HP and CP should think this, but got no reply. Since such an exclusion had no lawful basis, I decided to attend the 22nd of January meeting, timed for 10 a.m. in Ashburton Hall in Winchester. The scene was set for what followed. The minutes of the meeting show that it started on time. Nothing there indicates any disturbance at all during the meeting. The minutes also clearly show that Simon Hayes, the Police and Crime Commissioner for Hampshire, was present at the invitation of the chairman. The chairman was, in fact, Councillor David Stewart from the Isle of Wight, who later, in his witness statement, produced on the 4th of November 2016, confirmed that I was picked out by the PCC, and I'll read it to you. Mrs. Skelton did attend the meeting and was identified by the PCC. I was the victim of an organised physical ambush. Mr. Hayes seemed quite prepared to allow his minions to resort to thuggery. One of these, Darren Zammit, came up from behind as I sat drinking a cup of tea, leaned round me and put his face in mine, demanding that I leave the room with him. Now, next minute I know, while I was sitting down at the back of the hall drinking my cup of tea, and I have to say this now, there was so much officialdom, I was the only member of the public at it. There was no other members of the public at the public meeting. It was only me, so I didn't need much pointing out. I noticed there was some flapping going on behind my back. So I stood up and said to Simon Hayes, "What is this all about, Mr. Hayes?" He was foaming. He was so angry. He said, "You were told not to come." And I asked him why. He then went ranting and raving about my appalling behaviour at the Compass meeting in June 2014, how I stormed out of the meeting and trivialised it. Of course, this took me by surprise. And eventually I suddenly clicked, that was Nadine, I think. Are you talking about Nadine? You were told you weren't to come. You were told. He was really angry and upset. It was only when I took out my iPod to film him that Mr. Hayes made an effort to pull himself together and calm down. As you can see, any attendee at the meeting was expressly allowed to do this. Here's the conversation.
Because I don't like people writing me letters saying I'm going to cause trouble. I've never caused any. But Nadine O'Connor stood up and stormed out. I didn't do that.
I'm not saying you're causing trouble. What I'm saying is we're here to discuss now the budget for next.
But the whole point of banning me from the meeting was that I was supposed to be going to cause trouble. Now, as for the budget, I'm a taxpayer the same as everybody else. I was entitled to be there and hear what's going to be planned.
Because I don't like people writing me letters saying I'm going to cause trouble. I've never caused any. But Nadine O'Connor stood up and stormed out. I didn't do that.
I'm not saying you're causing trouble. What I'm saying is we're here to discuss now the budget for next.
When it came to my alleged troublemaking, I found out there was some tittle-tattle during 2015. Councillor David Stewart said in his latest statement, and he had been given anecdotal evidence from the Office of the Police and Crime Commissioner, that would be Simon Hayes, the invited guest, and local MP, that would be Steve Brine, who, may I say, has absolutely nothing to do with the Hampshire Police and Crime Panel. Well, isn't that a bit of backbiting? By now, a whole squad of security goons, including Darren Zammit, was closing in on me. After my conversation with Hayes, Zammit made a surge at me and had to be ordered back. He later had to admit in court that I, quote, might have been frightened, unquote, of him because he was a, quote, big gentleman. Yeah, unquote. His words. He later did lay his hands on me. He had no lawful powers whatever to act like this at all. Mr. Hayes spoke and acted as goon-in-chief.
We've asked these guys to back away.
I was absolutely terrified and frightened. I've never been so frightened in my life. I mean, there he was, organising a security squad to remove me from the meeting, and the meeting hadn't even started. As I said, I was sitting down drinking a cup of tea when I was accosted by Darren Zammit.
We've asked these guys to back away.
The grand finale came at a point when I thought I was going to be thrown out by Mr. Hayes' goon squad. I did the last thing I thought possible before this happened. To make my point with the Hampshire Police and Crime Panel members, mostly Hampshire councillors, and some of them who had dealt with my complaint, I approached the top table and tried to speak to them. As I did so, I was seized from behind by a police community support officer, suddenly present on the scene. This man violently manhandled me from the room, causing me painful injuries. Shortly, a van load of PCs turned up. They hustled me out of Ashburton Hall and bundled me into their vehicle, or into the cage, as Numpty in the Middle said. They then drove me to custody in Basingstoke, 20 miles away. All without a caution or a lawful arrest. I was held in solitary confinement for 22 hours. Then I was charged with assaulting the PCSO. So, it sky's the limit when it comes to saving the PCC's face at a public meeting. For Joe Blogg in the street, he may find for him there's a little less police resources next time he's mugged or burgled. At any rate, the show that day was being run for Simon Hayes' benefit, and very likely by him. One thing you can rely on Simon Hayes to do: he knows how to party! He certainly never thought his fun-loving ways would damage his prospect of keeping the PCC job. Whether or no, he still got voted out in May 2016. The third and last occasion I ever met PCC Simon Hayes was at the April 18th hustings in Portsmouth, just before that election. Here he is on the right, standing with the other PCC candidates. I spoke briefly with him about his actions at the HP and CP meeting. I called him a bully and a coward. All he did was shuffle awkwardly from foot to foot and gave a weak simper as he mumbled that it was nothing to do with him. If there's one person we wouldn't want back in this job, or any other for that matter, it's surely Simon Hayes.